There's a particular kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with a dramatic crisis or a visible wound. It arrives quietly over years in the slow accumulation of mornings where you wake up and feel the same heaviness you felt yesterday and the day before that and the year before that. It's the suffering of someone who knows somewhere beneath all the noise of daily life that they are not becoming who they could be. And what makes it especially painful is that it's surrounded by the appearance of normalcy. You have a life, you have routines, you have relationships, but there's something underneath all of it that doesn't move. Something that stays exactly where it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe longer. Most people will live their entire lives in that condition, not because they lack intelligence. Not because the world was too cruel or too indifferent, but because they never understood what change actually requires. They confused wanting to change with the willingness to pay for it. And those are two entirely different things. So let's talk about what's really happening, not in the abstract, but in the specific, uncomfortable territory of your own psychology. Here's something worth sitting with. The vast majority of people who say they want to change are actually describing a preference, not a commitment. They want the outcome of change without the process of change. They want to be more disciplined without tolerating the discomfort of discipline. They want deeper relationships without the vulnerability that depth requires. They want more confidence without the repeated confrontation with fear that builds it. They want to feel different while remaining in almost every meaningful sense the same, and this isn't a character flaw. It's not evidence of weakness or laziness in the simple sense. It's something more interesting and more complicated than that. It's a structural feature of the human mind. Understanding why this happens is far more useful than simply condemning it. Think about how the mind works for a moment. You're not a rational agent making clean decisions based on clear information. You're something more like a collection of competing systems, some ancient and automatic, some more deliberate and reflective, all of them running simultaneously and often in direct opposition to each other. One part of you genuinely wants to wake up earlier, eat better, have the difficult conversation, finish the project, pursue the thing that matters. Another part of you, older and faster and far more powerful in the short term, wants to stay comfortable, avoid pain, seek immediate relief, and maintain the familiar pattern of your life, even when that pattern is making you miserable. This older system is not your enemy. It evolved to keep you alive in environments where novelty was dangerous and familiarity was safe. In those environments, the organism that questioned nothing, stayed close to the known, and avoided unnecessary exposure to the unfamiliar had a survival advantage. But you don't live in that environment anymore. You live in a world where growth requires precisely the opposite: voluntary exposure to the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable, the uncertain, and your ancient machinery doesn't automatically update to accommodate that. So when you try to change and fail, when you start something and stop, when you make a resolution and abandon it, you're not simply weak. You are experiencing a real conflict between two parts of yourself, and the older, more automatic part is usually winning because it has a head start. It doesn't need to deliberate. It doesn't need to convince itself. It just runs. But here's where it gets more interesting and more uncomfortable, because the problem isn't only that the automatic system is powerful. The problem is that most people have unconsciously organized their entire identity around not changing. This is the part that almost no one talks about, and it's the part that matters most. Your identity is not just a description of who you are. It's a prediction engine. It's a story you tell yourself about what you do, what you're capable of, what kind of person you are, and what kind of person you are not. And that story has enormous momentum. When you try to act in ways that contradict it, you don't just feel uncomfortable. You feel like you're betraying something fundamental about yourself. You feel incoherent. And the mind finds incoherence deeply threatening. Consider someone who has identified as not a morning person for 15 years. When they try to wake up early, they're not just fighting fatigue. They're fighting their self-concept. Every morning they successfully wake up early creates a small crisis. If I'm not the person who can't wake up early, then who am I? What else have I been wrong about? And the mind, which is extraordinarily good at protecting its existing models, will find 1,000 ways to sabotage the behavior before it's forced to update the story. This is why change is so much harder than it looks from the outside. It's not just behavioral, it's existential. Real change requires you to grieve an old version of yourself before you can inhabit a new one. And grief is painful, even when what you're grieving was something that was hurting you. Now, let's go deeper, because there's something underneath the identity problem that's even more fundamental. And it has to do with the relationship between suffering and meaning. One of the most counterintuitive things about human psychology is that people often hold on to their problems not despite the suffering they cause, but in part because of it. This sounds strange until you look at it carefully. Suffering, even unnecessary suffering, can serve a function. It can be a source of identity, a justification for limitations, an explanation for failure, a way of avoiding the terrifying question of what you would do if you had no excuse. Think about that for a moment. If your anxiety is the reason you haven't pursued what matters to you, then your anxiety is also protecting you from the possibility of trying and failing. If your difficult childhood is the reason your relationships don't work, then your difficult childhood is also protecting you from having to examine your own behavior in those relationships. If your circumstances are the reason you haven't built the life you want, then your circumstances are also protecting you from the confrontation with your own choices. This is not to minimize real suffering. Real suffering is real. Trauma is real. Difficult circumstances are real. But there is a difference between suffering that you are working to move through and suffering that you have made into a home. And the uncomfortable truth is that many people, without fully realizing it, have done the latter. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, observed something profound, that even in conditions of extreme suffering, the one thing that couldn't be taken away was the freedom to choose on attitude toward that suffering. He wasn't making a naive claim that attitude changes circumstances. He was making a much more radical claim that the meaning you assign to your suffering determines whether it breaks you or transforms you. And meaning isn't something you find, it's something you construct through action, through commitment, through the voluntary acceptance of responsibility. That word, responsibility, is worth staying with, because it's one of the most misunderstood concepts in the entire territory of self-development. People often hear responsibility and immediately translate it as blame. If I'm responsible for my situation, then I'm to blame for it. And that feels unbearable, especially when the situation involves genuine pain or genuine injustice. But responsibility isn't about blame, it's about agency. It's about the recognition that regardless of how you arrived at your current position, you are the one who has to navigate forward from it. No one else can do that for you. No one else can want it for you. No one else can pay the price for you. And this is where most people quietly give up, not loudly, not dramatically. They don't announce their surrender. They just slowly stop trying in the ways that matter. They substitute activity for progress. They stay busy in ways that feel productive, but never actually address the thing that needs addressing. They read books about change without changing. They watch videos about discipline without becoming disciplined. They have conversations about their problems without doing anything that would solve them, and they do this for years, sometimes decades, while maintaining the story that they are someone who is working on themselves. There's a particular kind of self-deception here that deserves a name. Call it performative growth. It's the pursuit of the feeling of progress without the substance of progress. It's the person who journals every morning about their goals but never takes the concrete action those goals require. It's the person who knows every psychological concept related to their problem but hasn't moved an inch in addressing it. It's the person who is endlessly preparing to change, endlessly gathering information, endlessly waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right level of readiness. And the cruel irony is that this feels virtuous. It feels like you're doing something. It feels responsible even. You're not ignoring your problems. You're thinking about them, reading about them, talking about them. But thinking about a problem and confronting a problem are not the same thing, not even close. In fact, prolonged thinking without action can actually deepen the problem because it trains your nervous system to relate to the problem as something to be analyzed rather than something to be engaged. Let's talk about what engagement actually looks like, because this is where the conversation usually gets vague. And vagueness is the enemy of change. Engagement means doing the thing that you have been avoiding in this specific concrete form that you have been avoiding it without waiting until you feel ready. It means having the conversation you've been putting off for 6 months. It means starting the project you've been researching for 2 years. It means going to the gym on the day when you feel least like going. It means telling the truth in the relationship where you've been carefully managing the other person's perception of you. It means applying for the opportunity you've been telling yourself you're not ready for. None of these things feel good before you do them. That's the point. The discomfort before the action is not a signal that you shouldn't act. It's a signal that the action matters. The things that are most worth doing are almost always the things that produce the most resistance. Not because life is cruel, but because growth requires moving into territory that is genuinely unfamiliar. And unfamiliar territory genuinely feels dangerous to the nervous system, even when it isn't. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine you've been living in a house for years. You know every room. You know where the light switches are, where the floor creaks, which door sticks. You can navigate it in the dark. Now imagine you have to move to a new house. Even if the new house is objectively better, the first weeks there will involve a kind of low-grade disorientation. You'll reach for the light switch in the wrong place. You'll have to think about things you used to do automatically. There's a cognitive and emotional cost to unfamiliarity, even when the familiar was worse. Change works the same way. The new behavior, the new pattern, the new way of being requires active attention and deliberate effort in a way that the old pattern doesn't. The old pattern runs on autopilot. The new one requires you to be present, intentional, and willing to experience the friction of not yet being good at something. And most people, when they encounter that friction, interpret it as evidence that the change isn't working or isn't right for them, or that they're not the kind of person who can do this. And they go back to the house they know. What they don't understand is that the friction is the process. The discomfort is not an obstacle to change. It is change. Every time you act in a way that contradicts your old pattern, despite the resistance, you are literally rewiring the neural architecture of your behavior. You're building a new automatic, but it takes time, and it takes repetition, and it takes the willingness to be bad at something for long enough to become better at it. This brings us to something that is perhaps the most important and least discussed aspect of genuine transformation: the relationship between suffering and competence. There is a kind of suffering that is genuinely pointless, suffering that doesn't lead anywhere, that doesn't teach anything, that simply grinds you down without producing anything of value. That kind of suffering should be minimized wherever possible. But there is another kind of suffering, which is the suffering that comes from voluntarily engaging with something difficult, from accepting the weight of a challenge, from staying in the fire long enough to be changed by it. And this kind of suffering is not something to be avoided. It is something to be sought carefully and deliberately, because it is the mechanism through which competence is built. Think about anyone you've ever deeply respected, not admired from a distance, but genuinely respected. The kind of person whose presence makes you feel both challenged and steadied. Almost certainly that person has a relationship with difficulty that most people don't have. They've been through something or through many things, and instead of being broken by those experiences, they were shaped by them. Not because they were special, not because they had some innate quality that you lack, but because they made a different choice about how to relate to their own suffering. They chose to carry it rather than escape it. And the act of carrying it built something in them that couldn't have been built any other way. Competence is not given. It cannot be downloaded or transferred. It can only be earned through the accumulated experience of doing difficult things, failing, adjusting, and doing them again. And this is deeply unfair in a certain sense because it means that there are no shortcuts. There are no techniques that bypass the requirement of effort. There are no frameworks that substitute for the actual confrontation with the actual difficulty. Every genuine skill, every real capacity, every authentic confidence has a price, and the price is always paid in the currency of time, effort, and voluntary discomfort. But here's what changes when you understand this. Really understand it, not just intellectually, but in your bones. You stop waiting for change to feel good before it starts. You stop interpreting the difficulty as a sign that something is wrong. You stop looking for the path that doesn't require sacrifice because you understand that the difficulty is not a problem with the path. The difficulty is the path. Let's talk about habits because this is where the abstract becomes concrete. Most people think about habits in terms of behaviors. I want to exercise more, eat better, sleep earlier, work more consistently, and those behavioral habits matter. But there's a deeper level of habit that almost nobody talks about, which is the habit of perception. The way you habitually interpret your experience, the automatic meanings you assign to events, the default stories you tell yourself about why things happen, what they mean, and what they say about you. These perceptual habits are far more powerful than behavioral habits because they determine the context in which all your behavioral choices are made. If you habitually interpret setbacks as evidence that you're not capable, then every setback will reinforce your avoidance. If you habitually interpret discomfort as danger, then every uncomfortable action will feel like a threat. If you habitually interpret other people's success as evidence of your own inadequacy, then every encounter with someone doing well will drain your motivation rather than fuel it. Changing your perceptual habits is harder than changing your behavioral habits. Much harder because you can't see them clearly. They're not in the foreground of your experience. They're in the background, shaping everything you see without announcing themselves. They feel like reality, not like interpretation. And when something feels like reality, the idea of questioning it feels absurd, even offensive. This is why the most important work of genuine change is almost always internal before it is external. Not internal in the sense of positive thinking or visualization or affirmation. Internal in the sense of honest examination. The willingness to ask yourself, what do I actually believe about this? Not what do I think I should believe, not what sounds right when I say it out loud, but what do I actually functionally believe as evidenced by how I behave, because your real beliefs are not what you say. They're what you do. If you say you believe in your own potential, but you consistently avoid the actions that would develop it, your real belief is that you can't do it, or that it's not worth the risk. If you say you value honesty, but you consistently avoid conversations where honesty would be uncomfortable, your real belief is that comfort is more important than truth. If you say you want to change, but you consistently choose the familiar over the challenging, your real belief is that the familiar is safer than the growth. This kind of honest examination is uncomfortable. Genuinely uncomfortable. It requires you to look at the gap between what you claim to value and what you actually prioritize, and to sit with that gap without immediately explaining it away. Most people can't do this for more than a few minutes before the defensive machinery kicks in and starts generating justifications. The circumstances weren't right. The timing was off. Other people were involved It's complicated, and sometimes those things are true. Circumstances matter, timing matters, other people matter, but the defensive machinery doesn't engage with these things honestly. It deploys them strategically as shields against the uncomfortable recognition that you made choices and that those choices had consequences and that different choices are available to you now. Here's something worth considering. The people who change most profoundly are almost always people who reached a point of genuine honesty with themselves. Not the performative honesty of saying, I know I have flaws, in a way that actually functions as self-protection, but the real honesty of sitting with the specific uncomfortable truth about a specific uncomfortable pattern in their own behavior without flinching, without immediately moving to self-compassion as a way of escaping the discomfort of the recognition, without turning the insight into another thing to analyze rather than something to act on. That kind of honesty is rare. It's rare because it's painful. It's painful because it requires you to see yourself clearly. And clear self-perception is almost always accompanied by the recognition that you have been complicit in your own limitations. Not entirely, not exclusively, but meaningfully. And that recognition, if you can stay with it rather than flee it, is the beginning of something real. Let's talk about the role of relationships in this process, because change doesn't happen in isolation. One of the most underappreciated dynamics in human development is the way that your close relationships function as a kind of mirror that reflects back a particular version of you. The people around you have expectations of who you are, and those expectations expressed through their behavior toward you, their interpretations of your actions, their reactions to your choices, exert a constant gravitational pull toward the version of you that they know. Even when they love you, even when they want the best for you, this is not malicious. It's structural. The people who know you have built their own models of who you are, and those models are comfortable for them. When you change, even when you change in ways that are clearly positive, it disrupts their model. It creates uncertainty. It raises questions. Sometimes it creates implicit pressure because your growth makes visible the places where they haven't grown. And so often, unconsciously, they push back, they make subtle comments, they express skepticism. They treat you as the person you were rather than the person you're becoming. And if you're not aware of this dynamic, it can be enormously destabilizing. You can find yourself reverting to old patterns, not because you chose to, but because the social environment you're embedded in has a gravitational field, and that field pulls toward the familiar version of you. This is one of the reasons why changing your environment, your social environment in particular, is sometimes not optional. Not because the people in your life are bad, but because the version of you that they reinforce may not be compatible with the version of you that you need to become. This doesn't mean abandoning everyone who knew you before. It means being conscious of the social forces that shape your behavior and making deliberate choices about which relationships to invest in, which to maintain at a distance, and which to allow to evolve as you evolve. It means finding people who are engaged in a similar process of honest growth, not because they're perfect, but because their direction is aligned with yours. Because the people you spend time with don't just affect your mood, they affect your standards, they affect what seems normal, what seems possible, what seems worth pursuing. There's a concept here that's worth naming, even if we don't use its technical label. It's the idea that you tend to become an average of the people you're most consistently around. Not in a superficial sense, but in the deep sense of what you come to expect of yourself, what level of effort you consider normal, what kind of conversations you have, what questions you ask, what you think is worth caring about. The people you're surrounded by set an invisible floor for your behavior, and they also set an invisible ceiling. So if you're serious about change, one of the most honest questions you can ask yourself is, do the people I spend the most time with make me better, or do they make it easier to stay the same? And if the answer is the latter, that's not a judgment of them, it's information for you. Now let's talk about something that gets very little attention in conversations about change, the role of grief. Real change involves loss, not just the loss of bad habits or limiting patterns, but the loss of the self that held those habits and patterns, the loss of the identity that was built around them, the loss of the relationships and social dynamics that were organized around the old version of you, and loss, even when it's necessary, even when it's chosen, involves grief. A real embodied emotional process of letting go. Most people in the self-development space skip this step entirely. They talk about change as if it's purely additive, as if you're simply adding new qualities to an existing self. But that's not how it works. The new self is built partly from the material of the old self, but it also requires the dismantling of certain structures that the old self depended on. And that dismantling is not painless. It's not supposed to be painless. When someone leaves a relationship that was holding them back, even when they know intellectually that leaving was right, they grieve. When someone stops a behavior that was numbing them, even when they know it was destructive, they grieve the comfort it provided. When someone steps into a new role, a new career, a new way of being in the world, even when it's what they wanted, they feel the disorientation of having left something familiar behind. This grief is not weakness. It's not evidence that the change was wrong. It's the natural response to genuine transition. And the mistake most people make is trying to skip it or rush through it or suppress it with distraction and activity. When you do that, the grief doesn't go away. It goes underground. And underground grief has a way of expressing itself as resistance, as self-sabotage, as the inexplicable pull back toward the old pattern, even when you consciously know better. The more honest approach is to acknowledge the loss, to say, yes, this thing that I'm leaving behind served me in some way, even if it also hurt me, to honor the function it served before releasing it. This is not sentimentality, it's psychological hygiene. It creates a clean break rather than a suppressed one. And clean breaks are far more sustainable than suppressed ones. Let's come to something practical now. Because all of this understanding is worthless if it doesn't change how you actually live. The single most powerful thing you can do to begin genuine change is not to make a big plan or set ambitious goals or redesign your entire life. It's to identify the one thing you've been most consistently avoiding and do it, not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, not after you've thought about it more or researched it more or talked about it more. Soon, as soon as you can arrange to do it, because avoidance is not neutral. Every time you avoid the thing you know you should engage with, you're not just failing to move forward, you're actively moving backward. You're reinforcing the neural pathway that says this thing is too dangerous, too difficult, too much for you. You're deepening the groove of the avoidance pattern, and you're losing a small piece of your self-respect in the process, even if you don't consciously register it. Self-respect is not built through affirmation. It's not built through self-compassion practices or positive self-talk. It's built through the accumulated experience of keeping the promises you make to yourself. Every time you say you're going to do something and you do it, you build a small deposit of trust in yourself. Every time you say you're going to do something and you don't, you make a small withdrawal. And over years, the balance of that account determines how you fundamentally feel about yourself, underneath all the stories you tell about why things are the way they are. This is why small commitments kept consistently are far more powerful than large commitments that collapse under their own weight. It's not the size of the commitment that matters, it's the integrity of it. It's the experience of being someone who does what they say they're going to do, even when it's hard, even when no one is watching, even when the excuses are readily available. And this brings us to something that might be the deepest truth in this entire conversation, the relationship between integrity and identity. Who you are is not a fixed thing that was determined at birth or shaped entirely by your circumstances. It is something that is continuously being constructed through your choices. Every choice you make is a vote for a particular version of yourself. Every action you take is a statement about what you believe, what you value, and what kind of person you are. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, concrete, moment-by-moment reality of your actual life. This means that change is not something that happens to you. It's something you do continuously through the accumulation of choices that are slightly more aligned with who you want to become than who you have been. Not perfectly, not without regression. Not without days when the old patterns reassert themselves completely, but directionally, over time, with enough consistency to matter. The person who changes is not the person who had a sudden insight and was transformed overnight. That happens occasionally, but it's not the norm, and it's not reliable. The person who changes is the person who made a decision and then kept making it day after day in the face of resistance and doubt and the temptation to go back to what's familiar. The person who changed is the person who understood that the difficulty was the point, not the obstacle, who understood that the discomfort was the mechanism, not the problem, who understood that the grief of leaving the old self behind was the necessary price of becoming something more. Let's talk about time, because this is where most people fundamentally misunderstand the process. We live in an era that is extraordinarily hostile to the long game. Everything in the environment is optimized to produce immediate feedback, immediate reward, immediate relief. The entire architecture of modern technology is designed around the principle that waiting is unnecessary, that discomfort should be eliminated as quickly as possible, that any state of difficulty or boredom or uncertainty should be immediately resolved through stimulation or distraction or consumption. And this is catastrophic for genuine development, because genuine development is by its nature a long game process. It requires the ability to tolerate extended periods of effort without visible reward. It requires the ability to stay committed to something even when the results aren't yet apparent. It requires the capacity to delay gratification not just for hours or days, but for months and years. And this capacity, which is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term well-being and success that psychology has identified, is being systematically eroded by the environment most people live in. Think about what it means to build something real: a skill, a relationship, a career, a character. None of these things are built quickly. None of them have shortcuts. All of them require sustained effort over time with no guarantee of success and with the constant temptation to abandon the effort in favor of something that provides more immediate gratification. The people who build real things are the people who have developed the capacity to stay in the process even when the process is unrewarding in the short term. This is not a natural capacity for most people. It's a cultivated one, and it's cultivated through exactly the kind of voluntary engagement with difficulty that we've been discussing throughout this conversation. Every time you stay with something hard when you could have escaped it, you strengthen this capacity. Every time you choose the long-term benefit over the short-term relief, you build a slightly stronger version of the part of you that can do that. And over time, that capacity compounds. The mathematician's term for this is exponential growth. The initial stages look like nothing. The graph is almost flat. You're putting in effort and seeing almost no visible result. And then at some point, the curve bends. The accumulated investment starts to pay dividends. The skill becomes fluent. The relationship deepens. The character solidifies. The work produces results. And the people who weren't there for the flat part of the curve look at the steep part and call it talent or luck or privilege. They don't see the years of invisible investment that made the visible growth possible. You have to be willing to be in the flat part of the curve. You have to be willing to invest without visible return, to work without immediate recognition, to grow without external validation. Because the alternative is to stay in a perpetual cycle of starting things and abandoning them when they don't produce results quickly enough, which means you never get to the steep part of the curve. You never get to experience what becomes possible after sustained effort, and you spend your life wondering why things never seem to come together for you. There's one more thing that needs to be said, and it's perhaps the most important thing of all. All of this, the engagement with difficulty, the honest self-examination, the sustained effort, the willingness to grieve and let go and rebuild, none of it makes sense without a sense of what it's for, without direction. Without something that genuinely matters to you, something worth organizing your life around, something that makes the sacrifice feel meaningful rather than arbitrary. And this is where many people in the modern world find themselves genuinely lost. Not because they lack the capacity for meaning, but because they've been given the impression that meaning is something you discover fully formed, like finding an object that was hidden from you. That there's a passion out there waiting to be uncovered, a purpose that will reveal itself if you just search long enough or wait patiently enough. And when it doesn't appear on schedule, they conclude that they're one of the unfortunate ones who simply doesn't have a purpose. But meaning doesn't work that way. Meaning is not found, it's built. It's constructed through the act of committing to something and then honoring that commitment through action over time. It emerges from engagement, not from reflection. It grows in the soil of effort and responsibility and genuine contribution to something beyond yourself. You don't discover what matters to you by thinking about it. You discover it by doing things and paying attention to what calls you back, what makes you feel most alive, what you're willing to suffer for. That last criterion is the most honest one, not what makes you feel good. Not what you enjoy in the easy moments, but what you're willing to suffer for. Because the things that genuinely matter to you are the things for which you'll accept the difficulty, the uncertainty, the periods of failure and doubt and grinding effort. And those things, whatever they are for you, are the beginning of a direction. And direction, even imperfect direction, is the beginning of a meaningful life. The person who changes is not the person who finally figured out the secret. There is no secret. There's only the decision to engage honestly with your own life, to stop waiting for the conditions to be right, to stop performing growth while avoiding the actual process of it, to accept the weight of your own responsibility without either collapsing under it or resenting it. It's a decision that has to be made not once but continuously. In the small moments where you could avoid or engage in the daily choices between the familiar and the necessary. In the long periods where nothing seems to be working and the temptation to give up is almost overwhelming. In the moments of genuine grief, when you're letting go of something that no longer serves you. In the quiet accumulation of kept promises to yourself that slowly over time build a self that you can actually respect. There's nothing romantic about this process. It's not dramatic or inspiring in the conventional sense. It's mostly just difficult and unglamorous and slow, but it is real. And the things it produces, the competence, the integrity, the genuine confidence, the depth of character, the capacity to be present for the people you love, the ability to face what life brings without being destroyed by it. These things are worth more than anything that can be acquired without paying for them. The question is not whether you're capable of change. Almost certainly, you are. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price. And that's a question that only you can answer in the specific concrete choices of your actual life, starting not at some imagined future moment of readiness, but in the next hour and the one after that and the one after that. What you do with that is entirely up to you.